I remember the exact moment my world cracked open. I was standing just outside that classroom door, my hand trembling on the handle when a stranger stepped in front of me and whispered, "Stay calm. The real show's about to start." And inside, my husband, my partner of 42 years, was sitting beside a pregnant young woman, smiling like I hadn't seen him smile in years. That was the moment I thought I knew everything. I was wrong. But let me start from the beginning, because beginnings matter. They set the stage for everything that follows, and if you don't understand where this story started, you won't understand where it ended up. You won't understand how a single morning could dismantle 4 decades of assumed understanding, or how the same morning could eventually become the foundation for something new. It started that morning with a text message. Now at our age, texts are usually simple things: doctor appointments, grocery lists, reminders to take your medication. After 4 decades of marriage, you don't expect surprises. Life settles into a rhythm. Quiet, predictable, safe. That's what I believed. That's what I had built my entire understanding of reality around. The certainty of routine. The comfort of knowing what comes next. So when my phone buzzed at 8:12 a.m., I didn't think twice. I was at the kitchen table, halfway through my coffee, the morning light coming in soft through those old curtains Harold insisted we never replace. His message read, "I have to fly to New York for an emergency. Love you, babe." I stared at it longer than I should have. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Harold didn't usually say babe, not in texts. Not anymore. That was something from years ago, back when we still danced in the kitchen and argued about where to vacation instead of which medication worked best. Back when we still surprised each other. Back when we still tried. I told myself I was overthinking. At our age, you don't go looking for trouble. You learn to let small things pass. You learn that not every irregularity is a symptom of something wrong. Sometimes a text is just a text. Sometimes an unusual word is just a word. But still, something sat wrong in my chest. A quiet weight I couldn't explain. A sense that the ground beneath me had shifted, even if I couldn't see it yet. I typed back, "Is everything okay?" No response. And that itself was strange because Harold always responded. Even if he was busy, even if he was rushing, he would send a quick acknowledgement. That was who he was. That was who we had built our life around, the certainty of small gestures, the reliability of small responses. About an hour later, I was folding laundry in the living room when my phone buzzed again. A credit card alert. We had set those up years ago after a small fraud scare, the kind that rattles you but doesn't really change anything. Every purchase over $50 sent a notification to both our phones. It gave me peace of mind, or at least it used to. I glanced down at the screen. $784, Little Sprouts Baby Store. I frowned at my phone, reading the notification twice, 3 times, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. That store was maybe 10 minutes from our house. I had driven past it countless times, always noticing the soft pastel colors in the window displays, the hand-painted stork on the sign, the way young couples would walk out with that particular glow of anticipation and terror that comes with new parenthood. It was the kind of place you only went if you had a reason. A very specific reason. We didn't have a reason. Our children were grown, with families of their own. Our grandchildren were in middle school, past the age of onesies and baby monitors. That chapter of our life had closed a long time ago, neatly and completely. Or so I thought. So why was Harold's card being used there? I checked the time. 9:07 a.m. If he was flying to New York for an emergency, he should have been at the airport by then. Should have been through security, sitting at a gate, watching the tarmac through floor-to-ceiling windows. Not 10 minutes from our house, not at a baby store. I stood there holding a neatly folded towel, one of the beige ones we had bought on sale 15 years ago, feeling something shift inside me. You reach a certain age and you think you've learned all there is to know about your partner. You think you've seen every side of them, heard every story, witnessed every gesture. You stop questioning. You stop wondering. You settle into the comfort of certainty. But that morning, for the first time in years, I wondered. The thing about marriage, about long marriage especially, is that it becomes a kind of architecture. You build it year by year, room by room, until the structure becomes so familiar you stop seeing it. You stop noticing the way the floorboards creak in certain spots, the way the light falls through the windows in the afternoon, the way the whole house settles into itself at night. You stop seeing it because it has become part of you. And when something threatens that structure, even something small, you feel it in a way you can't explain. A tremor in the foundation, a hairline crack in a wall you thought was solid. I didn't call him. That's what I should have done, what the old Margaret would have done. But I didn't want to hear an explanation that might smooth things over too quickly. I didn't want to be talked out of my unease by a voice I had trusted for 42 years. Because what if that voice was the problem? What if the comfort I had found in it was actually a kind of blindness? Instead, I did something I never thought I would do. Something that felt foreign and wrong and necessary all at once. I picked up my purse, grabbed my keys, and walked out the front door. The drive was quiet. Too quiet. The radio was on, but I couldn't tell you what was playing. Some morning show with laughing hosts and upbeat music, the kind of soundtrack that felt obscene given what was happening inside me. My mind kept circling the same questions, the same desperate attempts to find an explanation that would make sense. Maybe he stopped there on the way to the airport. Maybe he was picking something up for someone else. Maybe one of the grandchildren had made a request, something they needed, and Harold had offered to help. Maybe I was being foolish. Maybe I was inventing problems where none existed. But deep down, beneath all the rationalizations, beneath all the desperate attempts to preserve the world as I knew it, I understood something with terrible clarity. This wasn't nothing. This was something. And whatever that something was, it was going to change everything. I pulled into the parking lot of Little Sprouts just after 9:20. His car was there, parked off to the side, half hidden behind a large delivery truck, parked like he didn't want to be noticed, parked like someone who was hiding. My heart began to pound. Not fast, the way it does when you're young and surprised, but heavy, like each beat carried weight with it, like each beat was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I stayed in my car for a moment, watching the entrance. People came and went, a young couple pushing a stroller with the exhausted happiness of new parents, a woman carrying a bag of tiny clothes with the particular care of someone handling something precious. Normal life, ordinary moments. The kind of scenes I had witnessed 1,000 times without really seeing them. Nothing that explained why my husband, who was supposedly on a flight to New York, was standing inside a baby store 10 minutes from home. I stepped out of the car. Each step toward the door felt unfamiliar, like I was walking into someone else's life, like I was a stranger in my own story. The parking lot was clean, well-maintained, the kind of place that suggested care and attention. There were planters with flowers near the entrance, a bench where an elderly woman sat watching the door with a small smile. Everything about it seemed wholesome, innocent, which only made it worse. Inside, the air smelled faintly of powder and fabric softener, that particular baby smell that triggers something primal in anyone who has ever held an infant. Soft music played overhead, something instrumental and soothing. The lighting was warm, the displays artfully arranged. It was a beautiful store, really. The kind of place you would want to visit if you were expecting. The kind of place that celebrated new beginnings. I spotted him almost immediately. Harold was near the back, holding a small bundle of baby clothes in his hands. He was studying them carefully, his brow slightly furrowed the way it always did when he was trying to make a decision. I had seen that look 1,000 times, in 1,000 different contexts. At car dealerships when we were choosing our first family vehicle. At restaurants when he couldn't decide between 2 dishes. At hospitals when we were making decisions about my mother's care. But never here, never like this. I didn't approach him. I couldn't. Something in my body refused to move forward, as if doing so would make all of this real in a way that I wasn't prepared for. Instead, I turned and walked back out. Because whatever this was, it wasn't something I was ready to face in the middle of a baby store. It wasn't something I was ready to face at all. I sat in my car again, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could have gone home. I could have pretended I never saw any of it, waited for Harold to return from his trip, and never mentioned the morning's discoveries. At our age, that's what many people do. You protect the peace. You preserve what you've built. You don't dig up things that might shatter what's left of your life. But something inside me refused. Not anger. Not yet. Just a quiet, steady need to understand. A need that felt less like a choice and more like a compulsion. Like a tide pulling me toward something I couldn't see but couldn't escape. When Harold left the store, I followed him, carefully, at a distance. He didn't head toward the highway. He didn't go anywhere near the airport. Instead, he drove across town to a modest building I had never paid attention to before. It sat between a church and a small library, the kind of place you pass 100 times without noticing. The brick was weathered, the windows clean but unremarkable. There was nothing about it that would make you look twice. He parked. I parked 2 rows behind him. I watched as he stepped out of the car and reached into the back seat, pulling out a small bag. The baby clothes. The ones I had watched him examine with such care. My chest tightened. A physical sensation, like a band being drawn around my ribs, restricting my breath. I watched him walk toward the entrance, moving with purpose, with familiarity. This wasn't his first time here. This was a place he knew. I waited a few seconds, long enough for him to disappear inside, then followed. My legs felt strange, disconnected from my body, moving on their own. Up close, I finally read the sign beside the door. Community Family Center Parenting Preparation Class. The words didn't make sense. Not in my life, not in our life. They floated in front of me, refusing to connect to any understanding I had of reality. Parenting, at our age. After everything we had already lived through. I stood there staring at that sign, feeling the ground shift beneath me. Feeling all the certainties I had built my life around beginning to crack. I pushed the door open. Inside, the building was warm, softly lit. A bulletin board covered one wall, plastered with flyers for support groups, childcare resources, local events. The kind of community board that tells a story of lives being lived, of people helping each other, of ordinary struggles and ordinary triumphs. Voices echoed faintly down the hallway. I followed them. Each step felt heavier than the last. I didn't know what I was about to see. I only knew that whatever it was would change everything. The hallway was longer than I expected, lined with photographs of families and children, motivational posters with soft colors and gentle messages. Every child is a blessing. You are not alone. Building families, building futures. The kind of messages that should have been comforting, but instead felt like a mockery of everything I thought I knew. I reached the classroom door. It was slightly open. Through the gap, I could see rows of chairs arranged in a semicircle. And there my husband, sitting in the front row, beside him a young woman, her hand resting on her belly, visibly pregnant. They were looking at each other, and Harold was smiling. Not his polite smile, not his patient smile. His real smile. The one I hadn't seen in years. The one that crinkled the corners of his eyes and transformed his whole face. I felt something inside me crack. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet, irreversible break. A fracture in the foundation of everything I had believed about my life, my marriage, myself. I took a step forward. My hand reached for the door, and that's when someone stepped in front of me. An older man, maybe a few years older than Harold. Calm, steady, like he had been expecting me. He placed a gentle hand up, stopping me, and in a low voice he said, "Stay calm. The real show's about to start." I don't know why I listened to him. At any other point in my life, I would have pushed past. I would have opened that door, walked straight up to Harold, and demanded an explanation right there in front of everyone. 42 years of marriage gives you that right. 42 years of fidelity, of building a life together, of standing by someone through every trial and triumph, gives you the right to confront them when they betray you. But something in that man's voice stopped me. It wasn't forceful. It wasn't threatening. It was calm, certain, like he knew something I didn't, like he understood that what I was about to do was not what I needed to do. "I think you have the wrong idea," he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine with a steady gaze that seemed to see right through me. I kept my eyes on the small gap in the door. Inside, Harold leaned slightly toward the young woman. He said something I couldn't hear, and she laughed. Soft, relieved. The kind of laugh people have when they feel safe. The kind of laugh that comes from being understood, from being supported, from not being alone. That word hit me harder than anything else. Safe. When was the last time I had heard him laugh like that with me? When was the last time we had made each other feel safe in that way? The way that comes from deep connection and shared purpose. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice lower than I expected, rougher. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced into the room, then back at me, studying me, assessing something. "My name's Walter," he said finally, "and I think you deserve to see this through before you decide what it means." I almost scoffed. See this through? There was nothing to interpret. My husband, who told me he was flying to New York, was sitting in a parenting class with a pregnant woman. There aren't many ways to misunderstand that. The mathematics of betrayal are simple. The geometry of infidelity is clear. 42 years or not, some things speak for themselves. "I've seen enough," I said. I took a step forward, determined to push past him, to confront what was happening, to finally give voice to the scream that had been building in my chest since 8:12 that morning. He didn't grab me. He didn't block me. He simply said, "If you walk in there right now, you'll only hear what your anger wants you to hear." That stopped me, not because I agreed, but because at my age, you learn something about anger. You learn how loud it can be, how convincing, how often it's wrong. You learn that anger is sometimes just fear wearing a mask, pain disguised as strength. And you learn that decisions made in anger are rarely decisions you're proud of later. I let out a slow breath, the kind that comes from somewhere deep that releases more than air. "What exactly am I supposed to do?" I asked, and the question came out more defeated than I intended. Walter nodded slightly toward the hallway. "There's a chair over there. Sit with me. Give it 10 minutes. 10 minutes. It sounded ridiculous. It sounded like nothing. 10 minutes against 42 years. 10 minutes against a lifetime of certainty now crumbling. But compared to the 42 years behind me, what was 10 minutes? What was 10 minutes against the possibility that I was about to make a mistake I couldn't take back? I sat, not because I trusted him, not because I believed him, but because I didn't trust myself. And sometimes, when the ground is shifting beneath you, when everything you thought you knew is being called into question, sitting still is the only safe thing to do. We sat in silence for a while. The voices from the classroom carried down the hall, soft, instructional, almost comforting. A woman's voice, probably the instructor, was explaining something about newborn sleep patterns. There was gentle laughter from the group, normal sounds, ordinary life. The kind of sounds that belonged to a world I was no longer sure I was part of. Inside, I was falling apart. Piece by piece, the Margaret I had been that morning was dissolving. The woman who had sat at her kitchen table drinking coffee, who had believed her marriage was solid, her life was predictable, her future was secure. That woman was gone, and I didn't know yet who would replace her. "You've been married a long time," Walter said after a moment. It wasn't a question. I looked at him. "How do you know that?" He gave a small, knowing smile, the kind that comes from experience, from having seen things. "I can tell." I didn't respond, because I wasn't interested in small talk. I wasn't interested in whatever wisdom this stranger thought he had to offer. I was interested in the truth, whatever that truth might be. "Did he ever give you a reason not to trust him?" Walter asked. I hesitated. That question landed differently than I expected, because the answer was simple. No, Harold had never been unfaithful. Not once, as far as I knew. He was steady, predictable, sometimes quiet to a fault, but always reliable. We had our share of arguments over the years, money, parenting. The usual things that couples argue about. But betrayal? No, that had never been part of our story until now, until this morning. Until this moment in a hallway, sitting next to a stranger, listening to the sounds of a life I didn't recognize. "People change," I said, more to myself than to him. Walter nodded slowly. "Sometimes they do, and sometimes we just realize we never knew everything." That unsettled me, because after 4 decades together, I believed I knew everything that mattered. Didn't I? I believed that 42 years of sharing a bed, a home, a life, meant that there were no more secrets, no more shadows, no more rooms I hadn't seen. Inside the classroom, chairs shifted. The instructor's voice grew softer, more personal. "Now, I'd like each of you to share why you're here." There was a pause, a moment of hesitation that I could feel even from the hallway. Then, one by one, voices began to speak. Young couples, nervous laughter, stories about first-time parents, unexpected pregnancies, second chances. The kind of stories that make up a life, that weave together to create community. I listened without meaning to, without wanting to. And then I heard Harold's voice. I'm here because I made a promise to someone a long time ago. My heart tightened. I leaned forward slightly, straining to hear. The room grew quiet. Even the ambient sounds, the shuffling of papers, the settling of chairs, seemed to stop. A friend of mine, he continued, his voice carrying that particular weight it gets when he's speaking about something that matters. He passed away a few years back. Before he did, he asked me to look out for his daughter. I blinked. A friend? The words didn't make sense. They didn't fit into the narrative I had constructed in my head. The narrative of betrayal, of a secret life, of a second family hidden in the shadows. She didn't have much support, Harold said, and I told him I'd help however I could. I didn't think it would look like this, but life doesn't always give you a choice. There was a softness in his voice, a kind of weight I hadn't heard before, the weight of responsibility, of honor, of a promise kept. The young woman spoke next. Her voice was shaky, uncertain. I wouldn't be here without him, I mean that. He's the only reason I didn't fall apart. I felt something shift inside me. Not relief. Not yet, just confusion. A new kind of confusion, different from the one I had carried into this building. This wasn't what I expected, not even close. This wasn't the story I had told myself. This was something else entirely. Walter glanced at me. Still think you've seen enough? He asked gently. I didn't answer, because I didn't know any more. Because the world I had constructed in the past 2 hours, the world in which Harold was a villain and I was a victim, was beginning to show cracks. And I didn't know what would emerge from those cracks. Inside, the instructor spoke again. Support systems matter. No one should go through this alone. There were quiet murmurs of agreement, the sounds of people who understood, who had been there, who knew what it meant to face something difficult and not face it alone. I sat back in my chair. My hands were still trembling, but for a different reason now. Not just fear, not just anger, something more complex, something I couldn't name yet. That doesn't explain everything, I said after a moment. My voice was rough, unused. Walter nodded. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. But it explains enough to know this isn't what you thought it was. I stared at the floor, at my hands in my lap, at the wedding ring I had worn for 42 years, the gold worn thin in places from decades of friction. At my age, you don't like being wrong about something this big, because it means the ground you've been standing on isn't as solid as you believed. It means the certainties you've built your life around might not be certainties at all. Then why didn't he tell me? I asked. That question came out sharper than I intended, more hurt. Walter didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was quieter. Maybe he thought he was protecting you. I let out a bitter breath. From what? Walter looked at me, really looked. From worry, from stress, from things he thought you didn't need to carry. I shook my head. That's not his decision to make. No, Walter agreed. It isn't. Inside the classroom, chairs began to move again. The session was ending. My pulse quickened, because whatever came next wouldn't be something I could watch from the hallway. Whatever came next would require me to be present, to participate, to face whatever this was directly. Walter stood. They'll be coming out in a minute. I stayed seated, suddenly unsure if I was ready, suddenly aware that I had a choice to make, that the Margaret who walked into this building wasn't the same Margaret who would walk out. You have a choice, Walter continued. You can walk in there angry, or you can walk in there willing to listen. I looked up at him, and if I can't do either. He gave a small, understanding smile. Then you walk in there honest. The classroom door opened. Voices spilled into the hallway. Footsteps followed. The sounds of lives continuing, of people moving forward. And then Harold stepped out. He saw me immediately. Of course he did. After 42 years, there are some things you don't miss. Some silhouettes you recognize anywhere. Some presences you feel in your bones. His face changed, Not guilt, not fear, something else, something deeper. Something that looked like a mixture of relief and terror. He took a step toward me. "Margaret," he said softly. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just about to hear the truth. I was about to learn how much of it I had never known. How many chapters of our shared story had been written without me. How many pages I had never been allowed to read. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Harold stood there just a few feet away, his eyes searching mine the way they used to when we were younger, when words weren't always necessary, when a look could convey everything. But this time, words were necessary, more than ever. This time, silence wasn't enough. I rose slowly from the chair. My knees felt stiff, not just from age, but from everything pressing down on me at once. Confusion, hurt, anger, and something else I couldn't quite name yet. Something that felt like grief, but not grief for a person. Grief for a version of my life that might have died that morning. "Margaret," he said again, softer this time, more uncertain. I held up a hand, not in anger, just to stop the moment, to study it, to try to understand what I was feeling before I spoke it into existence. "I think," I said carefully, "we should talk." He nodded right away. "Of course." The young woman stepped out behind him. Up close, she looked even younger than I first thought. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Her face was tired but kind. There was something fragile about her, like she had been carrying too much for too long. Like the weight of her circumstances had worn grooves into her that wouldn't easily smooth over. She looked at me with uncertainty, then recognition. "Oh," she said quietly, "you're—" "Yes," I replied. "I am." I didn't say more. I didn't trust my voice to carry anything beyond that. I didn't trust myself to say anything that wouldn't shatter the fragile peace of this moment. "Margaret," Harold said gently, "this is—" "I think I'd like to hear it from you," I said. Not harsh, but firm. The tone I had developed over 42 years of running a household, of raising children, of managing the 1,000 small negotiations that make up a life. He hesitated, not because he didn't want to speak, but because he didn't know where to begin. After 42 years, we had built a life on shared understanding. We didn't rehearse explanations. We didn't prepare speeches. We moved through the world together with a kind of shorthand that made words unnecessary. But now he had to find the words. Now he had to explain something that had no shorthand. Now he had to translate a year of silence into something I could understand. "Her name is Emily," he said finally, "and her father was a friend of mine a long time ago." I folded my arms, not defensively, but to hold myself together, to create a physical boundary between my heart and whatever was coming next. "I heard part of that," I said, "through the door." He glanced at Walter, who stood quietly to the side, a silent acknowledgement of something past between them. "I see," Harold said. Emily stepped forward slightly. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she said. Her voice was earnest, pained. "I told him he should tell you." I looked at her, really looked this time, not as a threat, not as an enemy, but as a human being. There was no arrogance in her posture, no defensiveness, just nervous honesty. That alone complicated everything. That alone made it impossible to see her as the villain of this story. "How long?" I asked. The question that mattered. The question that would tell me how deep this went. How long I had been living in a house with walls I couldn't see. Harold didn't pretend to misunderstand. "About a year," he said. A year. The word landed heavier than I expected. Not because of what I thought it meant, but because of everything it didn't include. A year of something I hadn't known about. A year of conversations I hadn't been part of. A year of my husband's life that had happened entirely outside my view. "And in that time," I said slowly, feeling each word as it left my mouth, "you didn't think I should be part of this." His face tightened, not in anger, in regret, in something that looked like shame. "I thought about it," he said, "many times." "Thinking isn't the same as doing," I replied. He nodded. "You're right." That simple admission softened something in me, just a little, just enough to keep listening, just enough to keep standing there instead of walking away. We moved to a small sitting area down the hallway. A few worn chairs, a low table with magazines no one ever seemed to read. The kind of space that exists in community buildings everywhere. Emily sat across from us. Walter remained nearby, but gave us space. For a moment, it felt almost like an ordinary conversation, except nothing about it was ordinary. Nothing about it would ever be ordinary again. Her father was named Daniel, Harold began. The name stirred something faint in my memory, a presence at the edge of my recollection, a face I had seen but never really known. Daniel, I repeated. From the service, he nodded. We served together for a few years, stayed in touch after, not closely but enough. I remembered now, a quiet man. He came to one of our barbecues decades ago, polite, reserved, the kind of man who stands at the edge of gatherings, watching more than participating. Life had a way of scattering people over time. Friends became names, became memories, became nothing at all. He got sick, Harold continued. A few years back, cancer. Emily lowered her eyes, the weight of that word, the weight of that loss. He didn't tell many people, Harold said. Didn't want to be a burden. I felt a familiar ache at that generation of men. They carried things quietly, sometimes too quietly, sometimes until the weight crushed them. Before he passed, Harold said, his voice growing thick, he asked me to look out for Emily. I glanced at her. She gave a small nod, a confirmation of a story she had probably heard many times, a story that had shaped her life. He said she didn't have much support, Harold added. No siblings. Her mother passed years ago. I was doing fine, Emily said quickly. At first, I had a job, an apartment, things were stable. She paused. But then I got pregnant. The words hung in the air, heavy, real, the kind of words that change everything and nothing at the same time. The father isn't involved, she said. Her voice was steady but thin. The steadiness of someone who has practiced being steady, who has forced themselves to be calm because the alternative is falling apart. I didn't ask for details. At my age, you learn there are some questions that don't need answers. Some wounds you don't need to examine closely to understand. I didn't know what to do, she continued. I didn't want to lose everything, and I didn't want my baby to grow up the way I did. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Harold. He was the only person I could call. I turned to my husband, and you answered. Of course I did, he replied. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt, just the simple clarity of a man who had made a decision and stood by it. That's two complicated things, I said. So you've been helping her, I asked, needing to hear it said plainly, needing to understand the shape of this thing. Yes. How? Financially some, mostly just being there, appointments, classes like this, making sure she's not alone. I let that sink in. This wasn't a secret family. It wasn't betrayal in the way I had imagined, but it was still a secret. And secrets, even well-intentioned ones, have weight. Even secrets kept for good reasons cast shadows. And New York, I asked, the lie, the text message that had started everything. Harold sighed. That sound carried more weight than any words could. That was a lie, I know that, I said quietly. What I don't know is why you felt the need to lie at all. He leaned forward, resting his hands together, the posture of a man trying to find the right words. Because I didn't want to worry you, he said. I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, because it was familiar, so familiar it hurt. You've always done that, I said, decided what I can and can't handle. That's not fair, he said gently. No, I agreed. It isn't, but it's true. Silence settled between us, not hostile, just heavy, the weight of 42 years pressing down on a single moment. I was going to tell you, he said after a moment. When? He didn't answer right away, and that was answer enough. That hesitation contained whole volumes of truth. Emily spoke again softly. I never wanted to come between you, she said. I told him that from the beginning. I looked at her, this young woman, this stranger who had somehow become entangled in my life without my knowledge or consent. I don't think you did, I said, and I meant it. Because the truth was, this wasn't about her. This was about us, about Harold and Margaret, about the spaces that had quietly formed over the years, the things we stopped saying, the things we assumed didn't matter anymore, the silence that had grown between us so gradually we hadn't even noticed it. "I need some air," I said finally. The walls were closing in. The weight of everything was too much to process in one place, one moment. I stood up slowly. Harold didn't try to stop me. He just watched, with eyes that held so much. Fear, love, regret, hope, all mixed together in a way I couldn't separate. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel everything shifting again. Not breaking this time, just rearranging. The pieces of my life moving into new configurations. New possibilities, new questions. Outside, the air was cool. Clean. The kind of air that clears your head even when your heart is full of storms. I took a deep breath. Then another, just standing there. Feeling the ground beneath my feet. Feeling the sky above me. Feeling the weight of my body in space. A few moments later, I heard the door open behind me. Harold stepped out. He didn't come too close, just stood there, waiting, giving me space, the way he always had when he knew I needed it. "I thought I knew everything about our life," I said, looking out at the parking lot. The cars, the trees, the ordinary world that had continued existing even as my internal world had collapsed. He didn't interrupt. He knew me well enough for that. "But today," I continued, "I realize there are whole parts of it I've never seen." He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "there are." I turned to face him, really face him, not the image I had carried of him, not the husband I had constructed in my mind, but the man himself, complex, imperfect, human. "And I don't know yet if that's something I can forgive," I said. The words were hard, but they were true, and at our age, truth is the only currency that matters. He met my eyes, steady, present. "I understand," he said. And for the first time since this all began, I believed him. Not because I wanted to, but because the truth was written on his face, in the lines around his eyes, in the slump of his shoulders, in the way he held himself, like a man bracing for impact but refusing to look away. I didn't go home right away. At our age, you don't rush decisions, not the kind that can reshape the rest of your life. You sit with them. You let them breathe. You let them unfold in their own time. So instead of getting back in my car, I walked. There was a small path behind the community center, one I had never noticed before. It led to a row of old benches beneath a cluster of oak trees. The kind of place people go when they need quiet more than answers. I sat down, and for the first time since that morning, I let myself feel everything all at once. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, the grief for what I had thought my life was, the fear of what it might become, and beneath all of that, something else. Something I couldn't name yet. Something that felt like the possibility of something new. 42 years. That's a long time to build a life with someone. You don't just share a home, you share habits, memories, grief, laughter, routines so familiar they become invisible. You begin to think of your story as complete, not finished but fully known, every chapter written, every page turned. And yet there I was, realizing there were entire chapters I had never read. Pages written in invisible ink, a whole library of experiences I hadn't known existed. I thought about Harold when we were younger, before the gray hair, before the quiet evenings and early dinners. He wasn't always the man who kept things to himself. There was a time he told me everything, about the service, about the men he served with, about the ones who didn't make it back the same way, about the things he had seen and the things he had done, about the weight of carrying memories that had no place in ordinary life. Daniel, yes. Now I remembered him more clearly, not just a name, a presence. It was years ago. Late 1970s, maybe early 1980s. We were still raising the kids, juggling work and bills and everything in between. Daniel came over once, maybe twice. He didn't talk much, sat at the table, listened more than he spoke. But there was something steady about him, a quiet loyalty that didn't need words. I remember Harold respected that deeply. The way he talked about Daniel when he wasn't around, the way his voice changed, became softer, more careful, like he was handling something precious. And now, all these years later, that same loyalty had come back. Only this time, I wasn't part of it. This time, the loyalty had created a secret I wasn't allowed to know. Mind if I join you? I looked up. Walter. He held 2 paper cups of coffee, steam rising into the cool air. I almost laughed. It felt strange accepting coffee from a stranger on a day like this, but I nodded anyway. Because sometimes you need the small kindness of strangers. Sometimes you need to be reminded that the world is bigger than your own pain. He handed me a cup and sat down beside me, leaving just enough space to feel respectful. We sat in silence for a moment, just 2 people. The bench, the trees, the quiet sounds of a world continuing to exist. Then I said, "You knew about all this?" It wasn't a question. Walter nodded. I did. How long? A while, he said. That answer didn't satisfy me, but I didn't press. Not yet. I was tired of pressing, tired of digging for truths that should have been given freely. Are you part of the class? I asked. He shook his head. No, I volunteer here sometimes. Support group work mostly, for older folks helping younger families. I studied him. There was something familiar about the way he carried himself, not physically, but in the way he spoke. Measured, thoughtful, the way men who have seen things speak, the way men who have carried weight speak. You knew Daniel, too, I said. It wasn't a guess. Walter smiled slightly. Yeah, he said. We served together, same unit as Harold. That explained it, the ease between them, the unspoken communication, the sense of shared history I could feel but not see. He was a good man, Walter added. I nodded. I remember. We sat quietly again. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the faint sounds of traffic from the street beyond. Normal life still going on. People going to work, running errands, living their ordinary days, unaware of the extraordinary dramas unfolding in ordinary places. Harold didn't tell you because he thought he was doing the right thing, Walter said after a while. His voice was careful, like he was choosing his words with precision. I let out a soft breath. That seems to be a pattern. Walter didn't argue, he didn't defend, he just sat there, present, available, the way good friends sit with each other in difficult moments. He's always been like that, I continued. Takes things on, carries them quietly, decides what I should and shouldn't worry about. I paused, and for the first time, I let myself see something I had been avoiding, something that had been there all along, but I hadn't wanted to look at it directly. And for a long time, I admitted, I let him. That was the part I hadn't wanted to acknowledge, not to Harold, not to Walter, not to myself, the part where I was complicit, where I had accepted the division of emotional labor without question, where I had allowed him to filter the world for me, to decide what I needed to know and what I didn't, because it was easier, because it was comfortable, because that's how we had learned to be married. You ever ask him not to? Walter asked. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it, really thought, dug back through the years, the decades, the countless moments where Harold had taken something on without telling me, the bills he paid that I only discovered later, the problems he solved that I never knew existed, the worries he absorbed so I wouldn't have to. No, I said finally, I didn't. Why not? I looked down at my hands, at the coffee cup, at the ground beneath my feet, anywhere but at Walter, because the truth was hard to say out loud. Because it was easier, I said. Because life was already full. Because when you trust someone, you don't always question the spaces they keep to themselves. I paused, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. I guess I thought if something mattered, he'd tell me. Walter nodded slowly, the nod of a man who understood, who had probably seen this before, who knew that the hardest truths are often the ones we tell ourselves. Sometimes people think they're protecting the ones they love, he said, even when it creates distance. Distance, that word stayed with me, floated in the air, settled into my bones, because if I was being honest, there had been distance. Not sudden, not dramatic, but gradual. The slow drift of 2 people who had stopped really talking, not about important things, but about everything else. The small details, the passing thoughts, the things that don't seem urgent but somehow hold everything together. When did it start? I couldn't say exactly. There was no single moment, no obvious fracture, just the gradual accumulation of small silences, the conversations that became shorter, the looks that became less frequent, the touching that became more functional than affectionate, the way we had learned to exist beside each other rather than with each other. When did it start? I asked quietly, not expecting an answer, just giving voice to the question. Walter didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was careful, measured. "After your health scare," he said. I looked up sharply. That hadn't been part of this conversation, or so I thought. "A few years back," he continued. "You had that surgery. Recovery took longer than expected." I remembered. Of course I did. Those months were a blur of doctor visits, medications, fatigue that settled deep into my bones and refused to leave, the sense that my body had betrayed me, the fear that things would never be the same. "He was worried," Walter said, "more than he let on." I swallowed. Harold had always been good at hiding that, at putting on a brave face, at being the strong one while I was the one who needed strength. "When Daniel reached out," Walter added, "it all happened around the same time." The implications settled over me slowly, like snow falling. Quiet, accumulating. "Harold didn't want to add anything else to your plate." I leaned back against the bench. That made sense. Too much sense. It fit with everything I knew about Harold, about how he handled crisis, about how he processed stress, about how he had learned over a lifetime to take on weight so others wouldn't have to. "So he decided for me," I said. Not a question, a statement, an acknowledgement of something I was just beginning to understand. Walter didn't disagree. "No," he said, "he decided alone." That difference mattered more than I expected. There was a world of space between deciding for someone and deciding alone. One was a kind of control. The other was a kind of isolation. Harold hadn't tried to control me. He had tried to protect me, and in doing so, he had isolated himself. "I would have helped," I said quietly. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere that still hurt. "I know," Walter replied. We sat there a while longer. The coffee had gone lukewarm in my hands, but I didn't mind. I held it anyway, something to do with my hands, something to anchor me to the moment. "You know," Walter said after a while, "you're not wrong to feel hurt." I glanced at him. "That's good to hear," I said dryly. He smiled slightly. "But you're not looking at the whole picture yet either." I frowned. "What am I missing?" He hesitated, just long enough to make me pay attention, just long enough to signal that whatever was coming was significant. "There's something Harold hasn't told you," he said. My stomach tightened. "Something else?" Walter nodded. "Something he's been struggling with." I sat up straighter, the shift in posture automatic, the body responding before the mind could catch up. "What kind of struggle?" Walter looked toward the building, then back at me. I could see him weighing something, calculating how much to say, how much was his to reveal. "That's not my place to say," he replied. I let out a breath, half frustration, half understanding. At my age, you learn that some truths belong to the person who carries them, that some stories can only be told by the one who lived them. "But I will tell you this," Walter added. "This isn't just about Emily." The words settled heavily between us, heavy with implication, heavy with meaning I couldn't yet see. "It's about him too," Walter said, "about things he hasn't said out loud in a long time." I stared ahead at nothing in particular, just thinking, processing, trying to hold all the pieces of this puzzle that kept getting more complex. For the first time since that morning, I felt something shift again. Not anger, not confusion, something deeper, concern. Because whatever this was, it wasn't just about what I had seen. It was about what I hadn't. It wasn't just about what Harold had done. It was about what he was carrying. I stood up slowly. My legs were stiff. My body was tired. But something in me had changed. Something had clarified. "I think it's time I talked to my husband," I said. Walter nodded. "I think so too." As I walked back toward the building, I realized something I hadn't expected. This wasn't the end of the story I thought I was living. It was the beginning of one I didn't yet understand. The ending I had anticipated, the dramatic confrontation, the righteous anger, the clean break, none of that was going to happen. Instead, something messier was unfolding. Something more human. Something that required more courage than anger ever could. When I walked back inside, everything felt quieter. Not because the building had changed, but because I had. The sharp edge of anger I carried earlier had softened into something more complicated. Not gone, just deeper, more nuanced, more willing to wait for the whole truth before rendering judgment. Harold was still in the hallway waiting. He had always been good at that, waiting me out when I needed time, not pushing, not crowding, just staying close enough to be there when I was ready. I stopped a few feet in front of him. For a moment, we just looked at each other. 42 years doesn't disappear in a single afternoon, even when it feels like it might. Even when everything you thought you knew has been called into question. "I spoke with Walter," I said. Harold nodded. "I figured you might. He told me about Daniel, about Emily, about why you stepped in." I paused, letting the words settle, letting him feel the weight of them. "But he also said there's more." Harold exhaled slowly, not surprised, just resigned. The resignation of a man who had been carrying something too long and was finally ready to set it down. "There is," he said. We moved into a small, empty room nearby. It looked like an office that hadn't been used in a while. 2 chairs, a desk, a window that let in just enough light to make things feel real. I sat down. He stayed standing for a moment, then sat across from me. The distance between us felt both vast and small, a few feet of space that contained whole worlds. "I don't want half-truths," I said. "Not anymore." "You won't get them," he replied. There was a time when that sentence would have been enough, when his word was all the reassurance I needed. Now it needed proof. Now it needed to be backed by action. He leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees, the posture of a man gathering himself. "I should have told you from the beginning," he said. "About Emily, about everything." "Yes," I said simply, not angrily, just truthfully. "I didn't," he continued, "because I thought I could handle it, that it was temporary, that it wouldn't affect us." He shook his head slightly, a small gesture of self-reproach. I was wrong. I studied his face. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to justify, just honesty, painful, raw honesty, the kind that costs something to produce. "What else?" I asked, the question that Walter had planted, the question that wouldn't let me go. He hesitated. This time it wasn't about where to start. It was about whether he could say it out loud, whether he could let the words exist in the air between us. "I've been having some trouble," he said finally. The words were vague, but the tone wasn't. The tone carried weight. The tone signaled that what was coming was not small, not trivial. "What kind of trouble?" I asked. He looked down at his hands. The hands I had held for 42 years. The hands that had built our life. The hands that were now trembling slightly. "You remember last year," he said, "when I started forgetting things." I did small things at first, where he left his keys. A missed appointment, repeating a story he had already told. At our age, you don't panic right away. You tell yourself it's normal. You tell yourself it happens to everyone. You tell yourself it's just age, just stress, just the natural accumulation of years making the mind a little less sharp. "I went to the doctor," he said. That caught me off guard. "You did?" He nodded. "A few months ago." "And you didn't tell me." He flinched, not visibly, but enough for me to see it, enough for the words to land. "I didn't want to worry you," he said. There it was again, that same instinct, that same pattern, that same decision made alone. "What did the doctor say?" I asked. He took a slow breath, the kind that prepares you for something hard. "They said it could be early signs of cognitive decline, not severe, not yet, but something to watch." The room felt smaller, not suffocating, just heavier. The weight of those words pressing down on everything. Cognitive decline, the phrase hung in the air between us, heavy with implication, heavy with fear, heavy with all the possible futures it contained. "And you've been dealing with this by yourself?" I asked. The question came out quieter than I intended, softer, less accusation than sorrow. "I thought I was," he said. I didn't respond right away, because suddenly everything looked different. The distance between us, the quiet, the things he hadn't said, the secrets he had kept. They weren't just about Emily. They weren't just about a promise to a dead friend. They were about this, about fear, about mortality, about the slow erosion of self that comes with age. They recommended staying active, he continued, mentally, socially engaged. He gave a small, almost ironic smile. So when Emily needed help, it felt like something I could do, something that mattered. I leaned back in my chair, not overwhelmed, but reoriented, the pieces shifting into a new configuration, a configuration I hadn't seen before. "So this wasn't just about helping her," I said. He shook his head. "No," he said, "it was about not fatting." That hit me harder than anything else, harder than the baby store, harder than the pregnant woman, harder than the lies, because at our age that fear sits quietly in the background. You don't always talk about it, but it's there. The fear of becoming less, of being forgotten, of losing pieces of yourself one day at a time. The fear that who you are is slowly slipping away and there's nothing you can do to stop it. "I didn't want you to see me like that," he said. I looked at him, really looked, past the gray hair, past the lines on his face, past the body that had aged alongside mine. I looked at the man I had married, the man who had walked through life beside me for 42 years, the man who was now sitting across from me, stripped of all pretense, all protection, all the walls he had built to hide his fear. "I've seen you through everything," I said. "Good years, bad years, things we thought we wouldn't survive." "I know," he said. His voice was thick, heavy with emotion he was struggling to contain. "Then why would this be any different?" He didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't logical. It was emotional. It came from a place deeper than reason. "Because this feels like losing myself," he said quietly. The honesty in that moment broke something open between us, not in a destructive way, in a necessary one, in a way that had needed to happen for a long time. The walls that had grown between us, built of small silences and unspoken fears, were finally crumbling. I sat there letting it all settle. The baby store, the class, Emily, the lies, the silence, the cognitive decline, the fear. It wasn't one thing. It was all of it layered together. A stack of decisions and omissions and good intentions and bad outcomes that had accumulated over years until they formed a barrier between us. "You should have told me," I said again, not as an accusation this time, as a truth, a simple statement of what should have been. "I know," he replied. We sat in silence, not uncomfortable, just real. The silence of two people finally facing each other without pretense, without the 1,000 small evasions that had built up over years. After a moment, I asked, "In the parenting class?" He gave a small shrug. "Partly for Emily," he said, "partly for me." I frowned slightly, not understanding. "I figured," he continued, "if I was going to help her, I should know what I'm doing." A pause, and maybe remind myself that I still can. I felt something shift again. This time it wasn't confusion. It wasn't anger. It was understanding, not full, not complete, but beginning. The beginning of seeing the whole picture. The beginning of grasping what had really been happening. Not just a secret kept, but a life being lived. A man finding purpose when he feared he was losing himself. A husband trying to matter in a world that was telling him his time was passing. "You didn't trust me to stand beside you in this," I said. The words came out softer than I expected, more sorrow than accusation. He looked at me, his eyes steady, present. "I didn't trust myself to be strong enough if I did." That was the truth, plain and simple, stripped of all justification, all explanation, just the raw reality of human frailty, of the fear that we are not enough, that we cannot bear the weight of being seen in our weakness. I nodded slowly, processing, accepting, not forgiving, not yet, but understanding. And sometimes understanding is the bridge that leads to everything else. "And now?" I asked. He didn't hesitate, Now I don't want to do any of it alone. I looked at him, at the man I had built a life with, the man who had made mistakes, the man who was still trying, the man who was asking in his own way for another chance, not to erase what had happened, not to pretend the secrets hadn't existed, but to move forward, together, as we should have been all along. And for the first time since that morning, I felt something soften completely. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the space where forgiveness could begin, the space where healing could start, the space where two people could begin to rebuild what had been damaged. "I'm still angry," I said. "I know. And hurt. I know that too." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what I was about to say, feeling the significance of the choice I was making. "But I'm also here," I said. He nodded, and in that quiet, unspoken moment, we both understood what that meant, what it cost, what it offered, what it promised. We didn't rush anything after that. At our age, you learn that real change doesn't happen in big, dramatic moments. It happens in the quiet decisions that follow, the small choices to stay instead of leave, to listen instead of assume, to trust instead of protect. We drove home together, no music, no small talk, just the soft hum of the road beneath us, and the weight of everything we had uncovered sitting between us. But it didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt like space. Space to think, space to feel, space to begin again if we chose to. That evening, we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared thousands of meals, countless conversations, more ordinary moments than I could ever count. Only this time, nothing felt ordinary. Everything felt significant, charged with the weight of truth finally spoken. I made tea. He didn't ask for it. I didn't ask if he wanted it. Some habits don't need permission. Some gestures speak their own language. "I keep thinking about that message," I said, placing his cup in front of him. He looked at me. "The one about New York." I nodded. "It wasn't just a lie," I said. "It was a decision, a choice to leave me out." He didn't argue, he didn't defend, he just sat with the truth of it. "You're right," he said. I sat down across from him, watching the steam rise from our cups, watching the evening light come through those old curtains we had never replaced. "I understand why you helped her," I continued, "and I understand why you were scared." I paused, letting the words land, letting them settle. "But I don't understand why you thought I couldn't handle the truth." He wrapped his hands around the cup, not drinking, just holding, anchoring himself to something. "I didn't think you couldn't handle it," he said slowly. "I thought you shouldn't have to." I let that sit for a moment, then I shook my head gently. "That's not love," I said. He looked up, meeting my eyes. "That's control," I added, "even if you didn't mean it that way." The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. At our age, truth carries its own weight. Truth doesn't need volume to be heard. He nodded. "I see that now." We sat quietly again, but this silence was different from the ones we had before. It wasn't filled with avoidance. It was filled with understanding, still forming, still incomplete, but present, real, shared. "Do you want to meet her?" he asked after a while. I knew who he meant. Emily, the young woman who had become entangled in our lives, the stranger who was no longer a stranger. I thought about it, about the woman I had seen sitting beside him, about the fear in her eyes, about the way she had spoken, not defensively, but honestly, about the life she was trying to build with whatever resources she had. "Yes," I said finally. The next afternoon, we went back to the community center together. This time, I didn't walk behind him. I walked beside him. The choice was deliberate. The statement was clear. We were facing this together, whatever this was. Emily was there early. She stood when we approached, her hands resting lightly on her stomach. There was nervousness in her posture, and respect, too. The combination of someone who knew she had stumbled into something bigger than herself. "Hi," she said softly. "Hello, Emily," I replied. There was a brief pause, the kind that can either grow uncomfortable or open into something real. The kind that hangs in the balance, waiting to see which way it will fall. "Would you like to sit?" she asked. We did, Up close, I could see more of her story written in the small details, the tiredness around her eyes, the careful way she chose her words, the way she held herself, not fragile but cautious, like someone who had learned not to expect too much from people, like someone who had been disappointed before. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. I looked at her, really looked. "For what?" "For being part of something that hurt you," she said. That answer surprised me, not because she said it, but because she meant it, because there was no defensiveness in it, no attempt to justify, just simple, honest acknowledgement of the pain her presence in Harold's life had caused. "You didn't hurt me," I said gently. I glanced at Harold. "This did." He accepted that without protest, without defense, just the quiet acknowledgement of truth. Emily nodded. "I told him you should know," she said, "more than once." "I believe you," I replied. And I did. I could see it in her face, in the way she held herself, in the earnestness of her expression. This was not a woman who had sought to cause harm. This was a woman trying to survive, trying to build a life, trying to do the best she could with what she had. We talked for a while after that, not about blame, not about the past, about her job at a small accounting office, the apartment she was trying to keep, the uncertainty she felt about raising a child on her own, the hopes she had, the fears that kept her up at night. "I don't expect anything," she said at one point. "I just didn't want to do it alone." I understood that more than she probably realized, because even in a long marriage, there are moments when you feel alone, not because the other person isn't there, but because something hasn't been said, because some distance has grown that you can't name, because sometimes being physically present isn't the same as being truly present. "I think," I said slowly, choosing my words with care, "no one should have to do something like this alone." She looked at me, surprised, then grateful, the shift in her expression subtle but profound. Harold didn't speak. He didn't need to. This moment wasn't about him. It was about two women, separated by decades, finding common ground in the simple acknowledgement of human need. That evening, as we drove home again, something had changed. Not everything, but enough. The air in the car felt different, lighter, less heavy with the weight of unsaid things. "I was thinking," I said, looking out the window at the passing streets. "Maybe we could go with her next week, to the class." "To the class?" he asked. I could hear the surprise in his voice, the cautious hope. I nodded, not looking at him, just letting the words exist, letting them become real. He smiled slightly, not the wide, easy smile I had seen earlier that week, but something quieter, more meaningful. The smile of a man who was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be okay. "I'd like that," he said. Over the next few days, we talked more than we had in years. Not just about this, about everything. Small things, old memories, things we had stopped saying out loud. The 1,000 small conversations that make up a life, that hold a marriage together, that we had somehow let slip away. And slowly, the distance we hadn't noticed began to close. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. The way it does when two people decide to show up for each other again, to be present, to be honest, to be partners in the truest sense of the word. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, I turned to him. The words had been forming in my mind for days. They needed to be said. "No more deciding things for me," I said. He nodded, immediate, certain. "No more." "And no more silence when something matters." "Agreed." I studied his face. There was still uncertainty there, still fear, but also something else. Relief. The relief of a man who no longer had to carry everything alone. "I'm still not done being upset," I said. The truth of it. The ongoing process of healing that couldn't be rushed. He gave a small, understanding smile. "I wouldn't expect you to be." I nodded, but I'm not walking away either. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, thick with emotion. "Thank you," he said. I shook my head gently. "This isn't about thanking me," I said. "It's about choosing each other again." And for the first time in a long while, that felt like something we could actually do. Not because it was easy, not because the past was erased, but because we were finally facing the same direction, finally seeing each other clearly, finally understanding that the point of marriage isn't to avoid all pain, it's to face it together. The following Tuesday, I went back to the parenting class with Harold. If someone had told me a week earlier that I would willingly walk into that room beside him, I would have said they were out of their mind. But life has a way of humbling you, especially after 60. By then, you've lived long enough to know that certainty is often just comfort wearing a disguise, that the things you think you would never do become the things you choose to do when you understand more of the story. The morning was cool, that soft gray light we get here in early spring. Harold drove. I watched the neighborhoods pass by, the hardware store on the corner, the diner with the faded blue awning, the church sign announcing the Wednesday potluck, ordinary American life, the kind built on routine, the kind that makes you believe you can predict what comes next. But there we were, headed somewhere neither of us had planned for, a classroom in a community center, a parenting class for a baby that wasn't ours, a new chapter in a story we were still writing. When we reached the community center, Harold turned off the engine and looked at me. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," he said. I almost smiled. A week earlier, that sentence would have irritated me. It would have sounded like another decision made on my behalf, another assumption about what I could and couldn't handle. But now I heard the care in it, the caution, the respect. "I know," I said, "but I want to." And I did, not because everything was fixed, not because the hurt had disappeared, but because healing at our age is rarely dramatic. It's usually quiet, a choice made one ordinary moment at a time, a decision to show up, to be present, to face what comes together. Inside, Emily was already there. She stood when she saw us, one hand resting on the small of her back. "Hi," she said, her expression softening when she realized we had come together. "Morning," I replied. Harold pulled out a chair for me. I sat down. And for the first time since this all began, the room didn't feel like a place where I had lost something. It felt like a place where something new might begin. The instructor greeted us warmly, handed out printed sheets about feeding schedules, sleep routines, what to expect in those first few exhausting weeks after a baby comes home. As she spoke, I noticed Harold taking careful notes. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. There was something deeply moving in that. At this stage in life, many people start to believe their most useful years are behind them. They say things like, "That's for younger folks now," or "I've already done my part." But sitting there, watching my husband lean into the lesson, I saw a man refusing to become smaller just because time had moved forward. And maybe in my own way, I was doing the same. Halfway through the class, the instructor asked everyone to pair off and talk about the kind of support new parents really need. Not the grand gestures, the day-to-day kind, the kind that keeps people afloat. Emily looked a little embarrassed. "I'm not sure I even know," she admitted. I turned to her. "Yes, you do," I said gently. "You just don't know you know." She smiled at that, a small, grateful smile. So we talked about freezer meals and grocery runs, about taking a shower while someone else holds the baby, about not pretending you're fine when you're exhausted, about asking for help before you're drowning, not after. I told her things I remembered from my own younger years. The sleepless nights, the fear of doing it wrong, the strange loneliness that can exist even when you deeply love your child, the weight of responsibility that doesn't lift but somehow becomes bearable over time. And as I spoke, I realized something. This wasn't charity. This wasn't me stepping into someone else's crisis out of obligation. This was connection, real human connection. The kind that reminds you life is still asking something of you. The kind that reminds you that your experience, your wisdom, your presence still matters. After class, the three of us sat in the parking lot for a while, not in the cars, on a low brick wall near the entrance. Walter came by and gave me a small nod, as if to say he already knew things were shifting. Maybe he did. Emily told us she had another doctor's appointment coming up the following week, and before Harold could answer, I said, "We'll take you." She looked at me with surprise. "You don't have to do that." "I know," I said. "I'm offering anyway." She blinked quickly. The way people do when they're trying not to get emotional in front of others. "Thank you," she said. Harold looked at me then, not with relief exactly, though there was some of that, but with gratitude, and maybe a little awe, as if he was seeing me clearly again, as if he was reminded of something he had forgotten about who I was, who we were together. It occurred to me that perhaps I was seeing him clearly too, not as the man who betrayed me, not as the man who failed me, but as the man who made a painful mistake while trying, clumsily and imperfectly, to hold on to his purpose, to matter, to be useful, to be the kind of man who keeps his promises. That didn't excuse the lying. It didn't erase the hurt, but it gave the hurt context. And at our age, context matters. Understanding matters. Seeing the whole picture matters. A few nights later, Harold and I sat on the back porch after dinner. The air was cool enough for sweaters. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then settled. The world felt still. The kind of still that invites reflection. "I've been thinking," he said. "That can be dangerous," I replied. He laughed, a real laugh this time, not forced, not hollow, and hearing it made me realize how long it had been since our home had held that sound without strain underneath it. "I mean it," he said. "I've been thinking about how easy it is to confuse love with protecting someone from the truth." I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said, "and how easy it is to confuse peace with silence." He looked at me. There was no defensiveness left between us. No trying to win. No trying to be right, just honesty, raw and real. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not the quick kind. Not the kind people say because they want things to go back to normal. The kind that sits in the air, that carries weight. The kind that acknowledges normal is gone. That if we want something good ahead of us, it has to be built more honestly." I felt tears rise, not the bitter kind, the soft kind. The kind that comes when something inside you finally unclenches, when the armor you didn't know you were wearing finally comes off. "I know," I said, and I did. These days we still have hard conversations, maybe more than before, but that's not a bad thing. That's actually the point. We drive Emily to appointments, we help where we can, we show up, not because we are trying to rewrite what happened, but because this is what love looks like when it grows up properly. Honest, useful, humble. And if there's any lesson in all of this, it's one I wish more people understood sooner. At any age, but especially later in life, love is not built by hiding burdens from each other. It is built by carrying them together. Sometimes what looks like betrayal is really fear wearing the wrong face. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't come from forgetting what hurt you, but from finally understanding it. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the worst day of your marriage becomes the day you both start telling the truth. If this story stayed with you, I hope it makes you think about the conversations still waiting in your own life. The ones that matter, the ones that heal, the ones it may not be too late to have. And if it moved you, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need the reminder that honesty, compassion, and second chances still matter.